Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, the Chief Executive here and also a proud City Club member. Today marks what would have been the final forum in our series on family resilience, except that we're going to continue it thanks to the generosity of some of our funders. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Eugene C. Roehlkepartain. He's the Vice President of Research and Development at the Search Institute. For the last year, thanks to the generous support of the St. Luke's Foundation, the William J. and Dorothy K. O'Neill Foundation, along with Goodwill Industries of Greater Cleveland and East Central Ohio, we've explored many facets that affect families and their ability to succeed: poverty, child abuse, neglect, and incarceration. And we've learned about theoretical frameworks that can guide future policy making and program design. We heard from Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund, from Judy Langford of the Center for the Study of Social Policy, Angela Patton, who created a father-daughter dance in a county jail, and Catherine Eden, author of the best-selling book, $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. And as I said, today would have been the final forum in this series, but thanks to a commitment from the St. Luke's Foundation, we'll be extending it. We're very grateful. With the help of our speaker today, we turn our attention to the parent-child relationship in an attempt to understand how strong relationships built between parents and children yield significant future benefits. Dr. Roehlkepartain is the author of the 2015 Search Institute study, Don't Forget the Families, the missing piece in America's effort to help all children succeed. In the midst of growing national interest in strengthening children's soft or social-emotional skills as critical for learning, work, and life, the role of the family in this process is often overlooked in favor of academic or scholastic programs. Through Dr. Roehlkepartain's research, which included surveying more than 1,000 parents with children ages 3 to 13, it was discovered that parent-child relationships are 10 times more powerful than demographics in predicting whether children are on track to develop the critical character strengths they need for success in school and in life. This finding, that family relationships eclipse economic or social standing as determinants of children's success, calls into question conventional knowledge on the factors that affect children's ability to succeed in school and in relationships at work and in life. So the fundamental question here becomes, how do we effectively support these relationships? Dr. Roehlkepartain has some answers. He joined the Search Institute almost 25 years ago. He is the author, co-author, or editor of more than 200 publications, including 30 books and reports, and is the primary creator of ParentFurther.com, Search Institute's online resource for families. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Eugene Roehlkepartain. That last name is a mouthful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. It's wonderful to be here. I will confess that my last name is my own fault. Everybody always asks about that. It was my wife's name and my name. We put it together, and we've been called Rumpelstiltskin, so I'll take anything. It's really great to be with you. I bring you greetings from Search Institute across the pond in Minneapolis. It's wonderful to be in Ohio and in Cleveland, where we have lots of friends and colleagues, and to be in conversation with you today. As a society, we really are not sure what to do about families, are we? We love our own, or maybe we're embarrassed by them. In leadership, policy, and think tank circles, we typically idealize families. We parade them around as evidence of our trustworthiness. And we claim to be on the side of family values and working families, or whatever the current language is. Families, particularly the types we idealized, have become sacrosanct. That, of course, is it unless something goes wrong. And then we assume it's the parent's fault. An uncaring, neglectful, inattentive, or ineffective parent must be blamed for the tragedy, whether it's a mass shooting or a toddler who darts away in a zoo. Less dramatically, we point fingers at families' failures when kids don't show up at school ready to learn, when they don't put away their technology, or when they don't treat each other the way they should. It must be parents' fault. In the worst cases, and there are too many, we intervene because of how families mistreat each other or neglect each other and those that are closest to them. But when families aren't making headlines, we think little about them. We ignore them. We give up on them. They're not our business. We hope they'll muddle through. These conflicting sentiments, the idealizing and neglecting attitudes we have, reflect competing narratives about families in our society. But these narratives, these two different narratives, really only capture, at best, part of the story. More problematically, they're neither helpful nor hopeful in how we shape our schools, our communities, our neighborhoods, our communities of faith, and others to partner with families to be strong and effective in the 21st century. It's time I propose to create a new script, a new narrative about families in America. This exploration begins with a fundamental and still controversial question about whether families are in the midst of a major decline or whether they're in a transformation that opens up new possibilities for freedom and thriving. So it's almost a cliche to say that families are in change. In the United States, the past half century has seen delayed childbirth and marriage, as well as increase in cohabiting couples, participation by the workforce by women, and a whole other set of changes in society. In addition to shifts in these egalitarian values, family life has become more complex and less sequenced. For example, a federal study found that 2/3 of unmarried mothers have experienced one or more partner changes by the time of their child's 3rd birthday. So families are changing. We know that. And many of us are part of those families and these and other shifts. In fact, if you go to family gatherings these days, as I sometimes do, we have a mix of traditional, blended, gay, straight, interfaith, interculture. You get the idea of families, each of us in our own ways. And we can all tell stories about our own families for better and worse. Each of us responds to these changes in different ways based on our own beliefs and perspectives. The narratives we internalize to understand these patterns have profound implications on how we respond to families. I see 3 broad responses at play. One is the idea that we reclaim the family. The second is we embrace diverse families. And the third, which I think comes between the two, is how do we focusing on strengthening all families. The dominant narrative in response to some of these changes has been to lament the decline of families, often arguing that families are under attack. For example, a national poll of 3,000 U.S. parents by the University of Virginia found that 64% of parents said family life has declined since they were growing up. This narrative typically emphasizes the structure and composition of families, who is in them and who does what roles, and then advocates for a normative structure that believes that raising children, that it believes is best for raising children and for society. Families don't look like they used to look, and so from this perspective, deviations from the idealized family norm are stigmatized and even pathologized. This agenda then becomes to defend and reclaim the family based on structure and composition, resisting normalizing families who don't fit that definition. From my perspective, the empirical evidence challenges this narrative at best, at least, and there's a different narrative that has a different story about what actually happens around the well-being of family. A fascinating study was done by Vern Bengston at the University of Southern California, where he followed longitudinally families for 4 generations in Los Angeles from the 1970s into the 2000s. And they included 4 generations, and he said, in the context of cultural changes reflecting increased individualism and altered family forms and functions, we had anticipated considerably greater evidence of weakening of parental influences. So that was the hypothesis they went into the study. Yet what they actually found was that families find ways to do the functions that are important to them, even as they change and as the world around them changes. Bengston and his colleagues wrote, families still matter greatly, and families can and do tend to perform well those functions that are particularly relevant to the lives of their children, even in different social and historical contexts, household arrangements, and living arrangements. From my perspectives, seeking to reclaim a narrow definition of the family won't move us forward. Then there's a second narrative, which is the narrative of embracing the diversity of families, emphasis on plural, and seeing this diversity as strengthening society in the same way that biodiversity is essential for a strong ecology. Advocates of this model emphasize that the nuclear family has been idealized in the past 200 years in Western society, but it's not really the dominant form of family in history. The loosening of social taboos that kept abusive families together and suppressed individual identities and expressions have opened up opportunities for greater personal fulfillment and greater justice and inclusion in society. So this narrative would go. A more personal polling question reinforces this narrative. So remember, the one poll asked about how families have changed and people saying the families have declined. If in 2010, Pew Research Center asked about the same number of adults, 2,700, questions about their family, and they found that 8 out of 10 adults said their families now are as close or closer than the family in which they grew up. So you put those two in contrast. So from this perspective, if the family has declined, it must be other people's families. We're doing just fine, thank you. This perspective can lead to the none of your business or anything goes attitudes. We do our thing, you do yours, we're doing just fine. Between these two vantage points is a third narrative which I think is most productive. It embraces the diversity of families, but also recognizes the importance of stable, nurturing families for children in society. It focuses on strengthening all families because families matter for kids and communities. And we've already talked about that, and many of you are working on that. So I know I'm preaching to the choir. Thus, this narrative recognizes that families in all their diversity and complexity and challenge have responsibility to and potential to nurture each other, not only for their own benefit, but as a cornerstone of community and society. We have a shared stake in the well-being of children, and that matters for all of us. To be sure, many families across the socioeconomic spectrum are characterized by interactions and patterns and practices that are counterproductive at best or harmful at worst. And at the same time, with very rare exceptions, families want to be nurturing, life-giving, and wells of support for each other. This narrative is in line with decades of research that have seen a shift toward more balanced and nuanced understanding of families. Across the spectrum, families have both strengths and challenges, as is reflected on this research on family strengths and resilience, which you've been introduced to through this series. Froma Walsh, one of the pioneers in family resilience, described the approach this way. A family resilience approach shifts from seeing families as damaged to viewing them as challenged. It seeks to understand how families can survive and regenerate even in the midst of overwhelming stress. A family resilience perspective affirms the family's capacity to self-repair. This narrative of strength and resilience accepts, even embraces the diversity of families, but it also recognizes the responsibility of families and society to adapt and ensure and adapt to fulfill their obligations and responsibilities to each other and to society. Unfortunately, in the midst of our debates about families, we haven't provided the supports and opportunities they need to adapt to the new realities. As Michael Weir wrote recently in The Atlantic, our policies have failed to address this new landscape, and because of this, we are inhibiting one of our nation's greatest contributors to public good and Americans' most personal aspirations, families. The Strengthening All Families narrative seeks to identify and build the strengths already present in each and every family. At the same time, it invites them into relationships and practices of family life that help them grow stronger together and work toward their own aspirations for their children. But where do we start? I propose that we start with what's at the heart of family life and the greatest source of power, their power in children's life, relationships. Now, at some level, that seems obvious. Duh, relationships, huh? But sometimes the obvious is the hardest to see, right? And I would argue that sometimes that's the thing we pay attention to the last. We can argue in education as a parallel that in the 90s we identified 3 new R's: rigor, relevance, and relationships. And we put millions of dollars into rigor, billions maybe, And we put millions of dollars into relevance, and we kind of set aside the relationships so kids would have time to take tests. But we know the relationships, the power of relationships is well established in the research. About 50 years ago, the influential psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner said every child needs at least one adult who's crazy about him or her. More recently, the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child at Harvard synthesized the research on childhood resilience and concluded the following. Whether the burdens come from hardships of poverty, the challenges of parental substance abuse, or serious mental illness, the stresses of war, the threats of recurrent violence or chronic neglect, are a combination of factors. The single most common finding is that children who end up doing well have had at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. The research is there. It's easy to assume that parents and other good-hearted people will just naturally do good relationships, but it doesn't always happen that way. Besides, it's easy to get so caught up in the practical demands of being a family together and working and all the other things in life that we can lose that focus. But what might be possible if we became more intentional and explicit and consistent in how we built relationships with kids in our families, schools, neighborhoods, congregations, and other organizations? At Search Institute, we've embarked on an ambitious applied research agenda aimed at identifying, understanding, and strengthening tangible aspects of relationships that matter in young people's lives. More than an academic exercise, we hope that what we learn together not only helps us remember what's important, but it helps all of us, including parents, get better at practicing relationships. Last fall, we released a national study of families that Dan mentioned that was conducted with the generous support of Walt Disney Parks and Resorts. For this study, we surveyed 1,085 parenting adults with children ages 3 to 13. These families reflected the rich diversity of economic, cultural, structural, and educational realities of families in the United States. At the heart of this study was a framework that we call developmental relationships. We include the word developmental to emphasize that we're interested in relationships that meaningfully help young people grow and thrive. So there are lots of kinds of relationships we have. What happens in relationships that help kids grow and thrive? Thus, we describe developmental relationships as close connections through which young people discover who they are, gain abilities to shape their own lives, and learn how to interact with and contribute to the world around them. 3 measures of thriving, one might argue. In designing the study, we talked to youth, parents, educators, and reviewed existing literature to identify specific aspects of relationships, specific actions we take in relationships that seem to matter. We ended up exploring 5 elements of relationship that we hypothesize make a big difference in kids' development and thriving. I should emphasize as we talk about these that almost by definition, actions in relationships are two-way, right? A relationship is a two-way thing. And with each person in the relationship engaging with the other in these positive ways. For clarity's sake, we've articulated them from the perspective of what a child or a young person needs in relationships. But when we introduce the models to families, one of the most powerful and insightful things we see is young people, children, internalizing what it means to show mom that you care, or sharing power with parents, or thinking about my own responsibility and how I'm being challenged to grow. So the idea of the 2-generation models that Family Connections talked about is really at the heart of what makes relationships strong. So in all of this, we've identified 5 elements of developmental relationships. And I'll just briefly survey these. First is expressing care. You guys know what that means. A young person might articulate this as, show me that I matter to you. We express care when we really listen. That means turning off the cell phones. When we're warm, when we're dependable, when we're encouraging, when we let kids know that we believe in them and we value them. The second dimension is a balance with that around we challenge them to grow, or we push them to keep getting better. This is the high expectations that you hear in a lot of the research. This challenge shows up in how we stretch each other, hold each other accountable, expect the best from each other, and reflect with each other when things go wrong and what we can learn from our mistakes and setbacks, because they happen. The third element of relationships that we measured focuses on providing support. which young people might describe as help me complete the tasks and achieve goals. We do this by helping them navigate systems, build their confidence, advocate for them, putting limits in place, and keeping them on track. All the practical ways that we help kids go where they need to go without taking over for them. And many of you do that every day in your work. The fourth is sharing power. And this is, by the way, one of the most interesting categories in the whole framework. In sharing power, young people might express something like, treat me with respect and give me a say. We share power by showing that respect, including children, collaborating with them, letting them take the lead sometimes. And I'll note that no aspect of this framework gets more attention than sharing power. When we do workshops with kids and parents together, this is the thing they most remember, is what does it mean to renegotiate bedtime, or to think about how we do homework, or all of these other things. And if you really want to have a robust conversation with parents, ask them about sharing power around technology use. You know where that's going. So this is powerful stuff, and it's controversial stuff in some places, and we have to think about what it really means in life. But it's part of what any relationship is about, how we share power in that relationship. And that's true in our relationship with our kids. What I'll just note is it's not saying equal power, and it's not saying giving up power. It's about sharing power. Fifth, expand possibilities, which we would be described as connecting me with people and places that broaden my world. We do this in ways that inspire young people to grow and broaden their horizons and make connections to other people who help them learn, grow, and thrive. So it's not all about what happens in the family. It's about how the family is open and connected to the world around them. So 5 areas, and if you want more about those, you can go to our website. Within these 5 elements of relationships, we then look at 20 specific actions that you can do in a relationship, and we won't get into all of that level of detail today. But suffice it to say that we're trying to get to a practical level where you can begin to see that one way we express care is to listen to kids. One way we share power is to respect each other. So you can begin using that as a tool for learning and growing. And by the way, this study focuses around families, but other relationships between teachers and students, mentors and students can also be part of those kind of conversations. So, going back to the national study, now that we've presented the framework, let's see what we learned about their relationships. I'll highlight just 3 takeaways. The full report is available online if you want that. The first is that developmental relationships can happen in all kinds of families. We asked parents a number of questions about their actions and attitudes, and then we developed scales that measured the strength of each of these 5 elements of a relationship. What we found is that across the spectrum of families report a lot of strength in the first 3 dimensions: expressing care, challenging growth, and providing support. And that was true also in another survey when we asked young people about their relationship with their parents. So those same 3 come up stronger. At least 3 out of 4 families exhibited strength in each of these 3 elements of relationships. They were much less likely, though, to report strength in the last 2, sharing power and expanding possibilities. In fact, fewer than half of the families that we surveyed showed strength in these areas, with only 1/3 of them showing strength in expanding possibilities. It is important to note that we saw a relatively difference in the quality of relationships across the diversity of families we studied. For example, we saw few or no statistically significant differences in family reports of these 5 elements across racial and ethnic lines, income, parent education, family composition, immigrant status, and community size. Families in all circumstances can have these kinds of relationships. Not all families do, but it's possible across a range of families, and that demographic factors are not your destiny. The second key finding from the study is that relationships contribute powerfully to kids developing the character strengths that they need to thrive in life. Particularly important in that framework is the idea of sharing power, when that seemed to be the best predictive of all the 5 elements in terms of growth and learning. Many things can contribute to kids developing character strengths, but family relationships seem to have a particular power. In fact, as Dan mentioned, family relationships predicted measure of thriving 10 times more powerfully than demographics predicted that measure of thriving. So we think there's something here to be paying attention to in family relationships. The third and final finding is that developmental relationships matter a great deal to help kids be resilient in the face of life's challenges. As I mentioned, we did another small pilot study with 600 families where we surveyed teenagers and their parents together in the same family. And we asked the parent about 13 different life stresses that they'd experienced. And then we looked at families who had experienced the highest levels of stress, focusing on what was happening in the relationships in those families. And what we found is that kids who were in high-stress families who faced traumas were much more likely to be doing better if the relationships were strong compared to the families in similarly high-stress situations but didn't have the strong relationships. In fact, those youth with strong relationships were 19 times more likely to be motivated in school, 15 times more likely to take personal responsibility for their actions, and 11 times more likely to have a sense of hopeful purpose for their future. That's compared to kids in the same level of stressful environment, but who didn't have the same kind of family relationships. So what we think is there's something going on here, at least in this pilot study, that says that the power of our relationships, the strength of relationships, can be a lifeboat to help us through challenging times. Doesn't mean we don't need as a society to deal with the challenging circumstances, but it does suggest that those relationships can be powerful in helping families survive those times and thrive in those times. So these findings give us some ideas about how families are doing and dealing with the strengths and challenges. How do we respond to that? And I would suggest there's three different shifts in the narratives that we need to make that reinforce the idea of strengthening families. The first is a shift from emphasis on programs to an emphasis on relationships. With few exceptions, most institutions have assumed that the way we engage families is to provide more programs for them. And our job is to sell them on what the good things we have to offer for them, right? I hear a little bit. And some of those programs are really good. So I'm not dissing that. But the leaders who are most successful in engaging families, particularly those who have been disconnected, invariably point to building trust in relationships as the foundation for engagement. To adapt that widely quoted aphorism in education, parents don't care what you know until they know that you care. These relationships begin or are renewed or deepened by first listening to families, not to just get their feedback on our ideas, but to develop an empathetic, deep understanding of their lives, the challenges and priorities and hopes that they have, beyond the stereotypes and assumptions that we may have about them. These conversations may lead to some programmatic responses, but that would happen then within the context of trusting relationships. The second shift involves reframing what we do from serving families to empowering families. If we recognize the strength and capabilities of families, we begin to see families as epicenters for growth and learning across generations. We engage them as leaders and contributors in our communities, not just as consumers of services in our communities. As these insights emerge, our roles as professionals begin to change from being the expert holder of knowledge to facilitating the skills of shared action around the issues and concerns that families have in their communities. The third and final shift in our narrative will involve shifting from institution to community-centered engagement. Most organization-sponsored activities occur within the institution's walls. Too often, the assumption is that families primarily need to support what we do and the institutions we have. For example, schools need parents to help kids learn. That's completely true. But by itself, it misses the power and potential of what happens in homes and neighborhoods where kids and families live and spend most of their time. So what if the narrative shifted to emphasize what happens in families and communities? Here I borrow from Mark Warren and his colleagues at Harvard. They propose a community-based relational approach for family involvement in education. It emphasizes building relationships, strengthening leadership, and closing power and culture gaps between schools and the low-income communities they serve. There again is the notion of sharing power, right? That vision has tremendous potential, we think, in the long term for transforming the way we engage families. So I propose 3 shifts in the narratives about families to focus on their core strengths, their relationships. None of this is easy or straightforward. Frankly, we're not used to exerting a lot of energy in engaging families on relationships and in authentic ways. It takes time to build trust. But we need to do so, not just for the families, but for the young people and for the future of our society. Perhaps in the past, it wasn't this hard. Perhaps the priorities, schedules, and expectations of schools, neighborhoods, congregations, and communities were in sync back then, with each mutually reinforcing each other. Perhaps there were simpler times, or at least to a point, and for some people. But for others, particularly those who've been on the sidelines and marginalized, that was certainly not the case. But however we review the past, it is abundantly clear that autopilot no longer is an option if we want to do the best for our kids. Partnering with families invites us to craft new narratives that weave wisdom from the past and new possibilities for the present and the future. What that looks like is likely to come from sitting in meetings, developing strategies to hook families. It's much more likely to emerge from listening to and authentically engaging with families with all of their problems and possibilities in real relationships and on their own terms. It will emerge from empowering and supporting them to find their voices and living out their priorities and aspirations in their own homes, communities, and the world. Perhaps then we'll have a better sense of what to do about families. Yes, we may still love our own and be embarrassed by it, but we'll also have a more honest and balanced understanding of both the strengths and the challenges that families face as they seek to nurture the youngest members of our society. And we'll be there with them to ensure that each and every young person has the supports, relationships, and opportunities they need to succeed in a complex, challenging, and exciting world. And I hope you'll join with me in telling that story. Thank you.
Well done, Jim. Thank you so much. Today we are enjoying another forum, another installment in our Resilient Families series. Today's is a conversation with Dr. Roehlkepartain, Vice President of Research and Development at the Search Institute. We're about to begin the Q&A, and we welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via our webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and we will try to work it into the program. We want to remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. Holding our microphones today are Marketing and Outreach Fellow Faye Walker and Director of Programming Stephanie Jansky. May we have our first question, please?
I have enormous sympathy with your perspective, but I have bumped into in recent years surprising number of instances when the street, the peer group, is found to be more consequential than the family in shaping character. Can you comment?
Yes, so the dynamic of peer versus family and how all that plays out in kids' lives. I think it's peers are become incredibly important during adolescence particularly, and it's part of why we're looking at peer relationships as well in all of this. So we're actually beginning to study how do we help young people shift to developing positive relationships. What I will say is that in general, kids, the evidence is that families remain significant and important throughout adolescence, even as peers become more important. And there's actually a lot of research on families being important for some things and peers being important for others, and that shifts for different families. So yes, families by themselves families by themselves can be an island of strength, but it can be particularly challenging if the other influences are not aligned. So at some level, yes, we emphasize strengthening families, and we have to recognize that families live in communities that may or may not be supportive of strength and well-being. So I think the danger that we have in terms of our work with families is if we assume that once kids start being influenced by the peers, that parents and families don't matter anymore. Sometimes kids will experiment with things to fit in a peer group, and then they come out the other end looking a lot like their parents. I think about that. I have two kids who are now young adults. We can all hope that, I think, or something. Maybe we hope it. But I have two kids who are young adults, and in both cases, their adolescents were, they were fine. I mean, don't get me wrong, but they struggled with some things, and they did some things that terrified us as parents, things start happening interestingly in the 20s sometimes, not always. But so I would say, yeah, we have to pay attention to the web of relationships in kids' lives and how do we help all of those relationships be strong, including peer relationships, family relationships, other adult relationships, teacher relationships. But I don't think we should cede power to peer groups just because kids have to develop power, those peer relationships, to develop autonomy during adolescence. It's a fundamental developmental need, and that freaks us out as parents. And at the same time, they're doing that with signals going off in their brain and figuring out how they resolve the conflicts between those. And sometimes we have more power in that than we think. So, yes.
Excuse me if you've already spoken about my question, but you stated that 46% of the families you surveyed said that their family life has declined. Am I correct?
It was another survey, but yes.
Okay. And what does decline mean? I mean, I heard everything you spoke about, what makes strength in families, but when they defined declined, I didn't quite understand what that meant.
Yeah, so let me clarify. That was a survey by University of Virginia that asked parents about whether family life in America has declined, and it was a general question. And so, yeah, they all said they had. And that's sort of the point. I think that is sort of an assumption in culture, that because it's changed, it's gotten worse. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to suggest we think critically about and look at the research that says, yes, it has changed, and there's also still lots of strength in the diversity of families. But we shouldn't idealize that either. So that's, thank you for noting that. But that was my understanding of their question in that survey. Yes?
Yes, I have a question on families and faith.
Mm-hmm.
Did anything in your studies indicate any kind of correlation between a family's faith or religious convictions and how productive and functional they are?
It wasn't a core research question for this study. I have, in other settings, have had a chance to look at that. And yes, there's a profound role that faith can play in families around creating a sense of norms and culture in the family and rituals and routines and values. And so it does play out. In this survey, we didn't have strong enough measures to dig deep in that. In other surveys, we found that families' religious commitments can be really a key part of family functioning. That said, there are families who are not religious who are also functioning well. So I don't want to sort of turn this into that debate. But yes, it plays a role, and we do writing about families and faith and the critical role of faith in shaping, because it's about shaping who we are as a family, our identity as a family, what we believe and value as a family. And that becomes a narrative that guides family life. Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
So I heard two themes throughout your talk. One is about respect, both with regard to working with children and families. The other about empowerment, the sort of sharing power and the things you would have to do to enable someone to actually act on that power. Do you have any sense of or any models around the country where you've seen communities or organizations really use those themes to success?
I think actually we've just this spring finished some work in 5 communities where we're introducing families with young adolescents to this model and having them dialogue about what it means in our family to look at this. And so I think the best I can do right now is to highlight some of that. So we bring, as kids enter middle school, which is a terrifying time for many families, and there's really very few supports for families at that age level. And so we bring youth and parents together and do some exploration of these different things and these different themes in these relationships. And that's really where it starts coming out, where frankly, by just giving families some tools, giving parents permission to struggle with this issue, to say, yeah, this is really hard. This is where these power plays become to happen in early adolescence. Lawrence Steinberg, one of the big family researchers, talks about how things happen in adolescence that where the kid doesn't clean up their room, and the parent's reaction is, oh no, they're never going to be responsible. They're just not, this is a sign to the road to ruin for these kids, right? And the kid's response was, I didn't want to clean my room. And so we get into these dynamics around power and respect and how different people see things that are based on where we are developmentally. Parents are in this place of, my job is to set kids up for success for life. And if they don't clean their room, they must not be hidden there. And kids are like, I want to go hang out with my friends. So it's about unpacking and listening to each other, and letting kids have a voice. And for some families, that's really hard. I remember one mom we worked with who had a really hard life and is terrified of what's going to happen to her daughter. And the way she's chosen to respond to that is by clamping down and doing everything she can do to control her daughter. And her daughter is completely freaking out. And she knows her mom loves her, but she hates how her mom is treating her. And so through the course of these 6 weeks, this mom and the daughter are trying to figure out how we do it. And the daughter saying finally, gee, I need to show my mom I care. I didn't know I needed to do that. She's my mom. So I think it's really about inviting families into space to struggle with these things. The other thing I would say about sharing power, just because it's a really favorite theme, is we always assume that we share power with kids around the sort of the little stuff, which color shoes they're going to wear today. And that's a good place to start. But I was really taken by an article on palliative care for children with cancer. And the researchers did a collaborative decision-making process in families where they invited the kids to be who are being treated for cancer to be involved in the treatment decisions. And what they found was that when kids and parents were working together on treatment decisions, a shared decision-making model, collaborative decision-making, the treatment efficacy was higher. So yeah, we can say that we'll keep the tough stuff to us, but engaging kids in the real issues that they're facing and giving them a voice and a say, again, not ceding power, but giving them a voice and a say in the things that matter, can be part of them taking ownership in their own choices and their own lives. So.
You spoke about how strong families can help alleviate high stress in family life. And I'm wondering if you have looked at, or if you may look at in the future, a comparison between families with strong relationships and high stress versus families with poor relationships but low stress, to see which children end up thriving in those two situations.
Yeah, we haven't done that analysis. I think that's really fascinating. And I think you're onto something there around families that are disconnected from each other, even if they may not experience some of the other hardships, don't have those bonds, that attachment, and that deep sense of being in this together that may undermine their development. So I don't have the data on that, but that's an intriguing question. I'll have to look at that. We have a paper for a conference this fall that we can maybe deal with that. So yes.
Gene, thank you again for joining us today. I wanted to ask you mentioned earlier about how people are stressing out because family life is declining, quote unquote, but your point of view is that it's really just changing. One of the most dramatic ways it's changing has to do with the introduction of technology into just about all of our relationships. Does the research say anything about how you can leverage technology to strengthen parent-child relationships?
Wow. You're going to make me go there. No, I think it's really a great question because the assumption has been that parents' role is to manage and control the negative impact of technology. And that's sort of been it's terrifying and scary, so we can't use it. I think there is emerging research around how technology helps us stay connected, how it expands possibilities in the world, how we monitor what's happening with kids so that we know what's going on through technology. I think what we're trying to figure out, and then we're doing this together with others, is how do we understand the virtual world as a new neighborhood that kids are growing up in? And there's threats out there, there's dangers out there, and there are opportunities out there. And how do we use some of the same skills, some of the same opportunities to set boundaries, talk about stuff, to engage with kids around those issues, so that it is part of kids' world. And I think there are ways that we have to, as parents, set boundaries on that, and there's ways we have to help them learn to navigate that. And so how that all works, I think, is still a work in progress. But I think it's not helpful to just sort of run screaming and assume that technology is a problem for our kids. The other thing I will say that actually is a larger problem around technology that's emerging in the research is kids complaining about parents on technology. And the parents not paying attention to the kids because they're paying attention to their smartphone or their email or whatever, their Facebook feeds about how great their family is. So I think that this is not, I think the original conversations were about managing kids' technology. I think we need to have another conversation about parents being present with their kids and letting go of the technology that's distracting them as well. So I don't know if that fully answered your question. Yeah.
Got there.
It's a big one. It is the most common question we hear when we talk to parents about this. Yes?
Any suggestions for organizations, school districts, and nonprofits on just sustainability? I think everybody here understands the importance of families, but the bottom line for our politicians and our schools are the academic outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so how do organizations that are constantly scrambling for money to engage family and do some of the things that you suggest, any recommendations of funding sources or other places that might?
Boy, if I'd figured that one out. No, I that is the real problem, because we've sort of assumed that we have to pay teach the class to get the test score results. I'm not sure that actually results in good test score results, but we can have that philosophical debate elsewhere. I think part of our challenge is collectively we need to do the research that connects the dots. So we need to, in our research at Search Institute, we're starting to develop measures of family relationships and start tying those to student achievement, so we can begin looking at these connections. So, because until we do that, either until it becomes self-evident, where people say, yeah, we just got to fund that, which I think we're a ways off from that. Until we do that, we have to continue to show the broader array of things that impact kids' academic achievement and their success in school, work, and life, and show the evidence that connects the dots. And so that's hard work, but I think that's part of why we wanted to go to the trouble of operationalizing a definition of relationships, dimensions of relationships that we can then measure and then track to see how they're tied to different things. So, for example, we can see that developmental relationships between kids and parents are associated with motivation to learn. That's a start. And so but it is the work we have to do, as long as we as a society see that as our only outcome of interest. So, yes?
Hi. Has your study involved any estimation or consideration of the impact of culture and systems upon the family, and your approach in terms of looking at, for example, back in the 50s and 60s when there was huge obvious oppression upon people of color, yet it seemed that their families were strong and resilient. Yet in this day and age, we are seeing almost what appears to be a collapse of our families. And so I'm wondering if your research in any way engages a discussion about what has happened, why are families falling apart, particularly in the African American community.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and we haven't. This study wasn't able to get it at a level of depth. What we do know is that economic strain and lack of access to fundamental services undermines family strengths, and so when families are chronically dealing with the lack of access to resources and opportunities, that it makes it hard to do relationships. So there may be something going on with that chronic pattern. We also know from research by folks like Robert Putnam that families who are kids who grow up in families that are really poor, for example, tend to have to have much less access to the social capital they need to sort of get on their feet. And so, for example, his study found where he looked at young adults who were looking back on whether they had any mentors in their lives during their teenage years. 2/3 of higher income kids said yes, they did. 2/3 of low income kids said no, they didn't. And so there are some deep inequalities and structural barriers that undermine families' abilities to be strong. And what we're trying to say is but there's potential for strength in the midst of those challenges as well. So there's a dance there. I think the other thing we need to do is to invite families to tell their story of strength, even in the midst of the challenges they're facing. Because even as families may not show evidence of a lot of strength, sometimes there's that one thing that can be that pull them forward and invite them into trying some new things. So finding and tapping and celebrating the strengths, even in the midst of a lot of turbulence or even dysfunction, can sometimes be part of what draws them out and moves them forward. But that's looking at the family level. I think thinking systemically in communities about what does it mean to isolate communities economically and all of that other structural stuff, institutional racism and those things, I think those are a wider set of issues. What's fun, I will say, is in one of our communities, we brought together the middle class families of the community and those who are working in the meatpacking plants, Latino and white and African American, and dialoguing around their families, around these relationships. And what one of the parents said, and I can almost get the quote right, is, I don't understand your words, but I understand you. As you understand that these are things, these strengths in families, these kind of relationships are things that we're working on almost regardless of our circumstances. And so finding ways to come together around our relationships and learning from each other, there's a new opportunity for breaking out of some of these silos, I hope. I'd love to see that would happen.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
very much for your talk and for the research. I've been a fan of the Search Institute for many years. We were saying that
Great.
at our table. So I'm curious about the third factor that you mentioned on providing support because of the dialogue in the media that so often criticizes parents for offering too much support.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about helicopter parenting
Yes.
and kind of the that conversation about, when should parents be part of that and when should they back off?
Yeah. Yes, it's one of my pet peeves, so thank you. So there are helicopter parents, but I think, again, that's used as an excuse to have parents stay out of kids' business, particularly at the college level. So I guess I would push back on that narrative, and I would suggest to parents, you need to rethink your involvement in some cases, because this comes back to the sharing power. If parents are taking over and not sharing power and trying to run kids' lives, it's not helping kids grow up. If parents are engaged and supporting kids and helping kids problem solve and learn and work the system, that's a different deal. One of our sons had some significant challenges he was dealing with, and it took my wife, she was more accessible than I was, to be a strong advocate so he could get what he needed. And that was critical for him at that time. Some people would say she might have been a helicopter parent in those circumstances. But the challenge is the system wasn't working for him. And so I guess I want to push back on that as sort of once kids are teenagers, we're going to let them cede from their responsibility as parents because that makes them look like helicopter parents, and have them think through what does your kid need from you now? What kind of support do they need from you when you go away to college? What kind of support do they need from you in high school? Not to say they don't need you anymore, and if you're involved, you must be a helicopter parent. So So I don't know if that answers, that may just stir up a whole other can of worms. But for me, it's about, I think one of our challenges in parenting and adolescence is kids are ready to turn to their peers. That's where the fun is. And parents are being told over and over, you don't matter anymore. Other things matter. You're a helicopter. And so, and kids don't need us to drive them around as much. So we get out of their business. And I don't think that's good for kids. So finding the right way to do that is, I think, the dialogue we need to have about that. So, yeah.
Great.
Great, thank you.
Excellent, really excellent. Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a forum with Dr. Eugene C. Roehlkepartain, Vice President of Research and Development at the Search Institute. Today's forum is part of the Resilient Family Series sponsored by generous grants from the William J. and Dorothy K. O'Neill Foundation and the St. Luke's Foundation, along with Goodwill Industries of Greater Cleveland and East Central Ohio. We appreciate your ongoing support. Our community partner for today's forum was the Family Connections of Northeast Ohio, and our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. Additionally, we welcome guests at a table hosted by Cuyahoga Community College. Thank you all so much for being here today. That brings us to the end of our forum. Thank you very much, Gene. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.